Thank you all for coming. I'm Kathleen Hartnett-White. I'm Distinguished Senior Fellow for Energy Environment at the Foundation and am delighted to moderate this panel on water in Texas. I'm so pleased at the panel we have, who in just a few moments I will introduce individually. But they represent final decision makers in the state on water from in a variety of different roles. And I love to remember that among all the natural resources issues, or natural resources, allocating water is still, under law, the province of the state, and is not merely something under federal control, which I think, unfortunately, almost all natural resource use is now. So I think this is very important for Texas. Just very quickly, many of you may have lived through this history and don't need to have it repeated, but Texas in 1997 passed landmark legislation we all call Senate Bill 1 that on the tails of a severe drought recognized that the rate of growth in Texas was going to, in many areas, not every area, but in many areas of the state, was going to outstrip water supply. And actually those growth rates projected since 1997 have in almost every area been exceeded. Because of population growth and, thankfully, an increasingly robust economy. Senate Bill 1 led to creation Wonderful Texas, bottoms-up, local area, regional water plans that then the state, through the Texas Water Development Board, put into a state water plan. But it was really a compilation of what local regions wanted. The state was not empowered by that law to implement the plan. That was also to remain something that had to do with the choice and decisions of local areas, or for that matter, private parties. At this point in time, I think most people, drought or no drought, recognize that Texas is significantly behind on executing a wide variety of projects, which were identified carefully in the state water plan as projects to increase the state water supply. So the title of this panel is Where's the Water? Lots of questions, I think, remain. And as for my perspective as someone that worked in this water world for a long time, Texas has got to expedite and facilitate some of these projects. The time is kind of running out. And I noted that the Dallas Federal Reserve Bank does like a quarterly magazine called Southwest Economy, and the cover story on this most recent one is about water in Texas, and they write, it's very general, but they write it with great concern that the one perhaps missing strength in the Texas dynamics for continued economic growth is a secure, reliable water supply that can withstand droughts and meet increasing demands. And they even conclude that by 2020, under current allocation with no new water supply, that the available water supply of Texas would contract it would be about 3.3% less, but demand would have risen 5.4%. Interesting article if you want to read it, but we are very privileged to have, as I said, final decision makers on these issues in Texas, and who will share with us their perspective on the issue. Our first speaker will be Representative Doug Miller, who represents and has represented the, I just call it the El Paso area. I'm sure the San Antonio area, but I'm sure it has a district number. That's right. A veteran of many complicated issues in San Antonio and the Guadalupe River Basin, who lived through the history that I was talking about with keen insights on this. Secondly, we have Carlos Rubenstein, the new chairman of the sort of newly fashioned by the Texas legislature, Water Development Board. I worked in previous roles very closely with Carlos. Am so pleased to see him continually move up as an extremely highly respected decision maker in Texas on water. He was water master of the Lower Rio Grande in Texas. He was commissioner of TCEQ only until September 1st of last year, and became the first chairman of a 3-member Texas Water Development Board. We also have Tim Timmerman, who has begun his second 6-year term as chairman of the Lower Colorado River Authority, the biggest river authority in Texas, what is really a very large water and electric utility. who is now wrestling with all kinds of complicated issues that the drought has imposed on this river basin. And we have Richard Roth, who is Chairman, President, and Chief Executive Officer of San Jose Water Corporation, which is one of the largest private water utilities in the state, and who is doing business in Texas now. So I would just ask at the moment, Doug, for you two, and we'd appreciate if you'd stand up, but if you don't want to, that's fine. We've had some attendees say they can hear and understand more clearly if speakers stand, but we're flexible. Sure.
Thank you very much, Kathleen. Appreciate the opportunity to be here and the invitation, and I appreciate TPPF for putting on such a fabulous forum to discuss so many issues and bring together a lot of folks from all over the state of Texas with different ideas about how we can improve the way we're doing business and the way we legislate. So I really appreciate the opportunity and also the introduction by Kathleen. There were a number of times when I was chairman of the board of the Edwards-Ockford Authority that we were not on the same panel. She, as a commissioner for the TCEQ, I was kneeling in front of and begging for forgiveness sometimes. And we always didn't see eye to eye, but she was always very fair. So I appreciate that, and it's very a great panel that brings together different perspectives. Certainly Carlos and I have worked together for a number of years and all of his background and knowledge, and I congratulate him on his new position. And we had a little conversation just before this meeting, and I'm very confident that he's got the right ideas about where we need to go and is taking the bull by the horns, if you will. And certainly Tim, with his leadership over at the King of River Authorities, LCRA, and if you don't believe that, just ask the LCRA, and they will tell you, and certainly Rich, who has his company has made a huge investment in Texas, and hopefully they will continue to invest their capital in Texas because just as Kathleen said, and I know many of you have heard me say, addressing the issue. I'm glad the Fed finally listened to what I had to say. I'm being tongue-in-cheek there, but the fact is that we do have a great economic engine in this state. But as those of you that have heard me speak, especially when we were talking about Prop 6, our engine is fragile. And I really, truly believe, and have maintained for years, that the fuel that's driving the engine, called Texas economy, is water. And we have to be careful that we either don't run out of fuel or we don't have enough of the right fuel. We certainly don't want to be putting diesel in a gasoline engine or vice versa. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. I guess some of the perspectives that you may want to hear today from me is about some of the ideas or some of the things that we're going to be possibly addressing in the 84th session. So I got my crystal ball out, and we're going to have a change in the leadership in the House. Chairman Ritter, after 3 very successful, certainly his last session was the most successful sessions as chairman of the Natural Resources Committee. There'll be a change at the helm there, and only Speaker Strauss and his infinite wisdom knows who that might be, and probably doesn't even, in my conversation with him, doesn't know who that would be. And certainly if he did, he wouldn't tell me at this point in time. But there are, water is absolutely a critical issue for our state's future. I heard some comments from some of my colleagues that, whoa, boy, we're glad we got that huge water session behind us, and we did what we needed to do, and we got through Prop 6. Now we can move on to the other issues in the 84th session. And to make a comment like that, I hate to burst their bubble. However, that kind of thinking says that, oh, wow, we've solved all the water problems now, and we've solved all the education problems, and we've solved all of the healthcare problems, and we've solved all the transportation problems. I mean, those issues, to me, those four, and certainly there are dozens and dozens of others, but those issues, in my opinion, my humble opinion, are not going to go away for as long as we've got a state like Texas that continues to grow and continues to have the economy that we have. So in that regard, I'll just touch on a couple of things. I know that Kathleen and the other members of the panel said, what are we going to talk about? And I'm going to try to focus a little bit more on groundwater, but yet touch on a few of the other issues. Certainly, there's an issue about local control, the groundwater conservation districts. How are we going to continue to maintain local control, which, certainly this group, not everybody feels the same, but I believe in local control. I want to make sure that we've taken care of the local communities first and their resources. But, it's come to a situation now with the creation of all the groundwater conservation districts that I think we need to take a look at, and it's not necessarily in the 84th, but we need to begin thinking about how is there some way that we can create some uniformity or some standardization, if you will, among the groundwater conservation districts and the way they operate, and to without usurping their control or their ability to take care of their local needs. And those are some of the challenges that I think you're going to hear from some of the other panelists and that are facing us. And as Carlos and Marianne and Beck, go about implementing HB4 and Prop 6 and spending our money there, that it's going to be important that we as a legislature give them the tools to provide for the supply and that we need for Texas. So I think GCDs and how we deal with the desired future conditions, how we deal with the local issues that different groundwater conservation districts have, are going to be important. 5 minutes. Whoa. Okay, let me speed on here. Enough about them. Another issue, and you'll hear some people out talking, and let me tell you, as Carlos and I were talking, there's a lot of people that are well-intentioned, and there are a lot of sound bites about things that you can do to solve, quote unquote, the water issue. Brackish water is certainly one of them. I am not in any way diminishing the opportunities that we might have there with highly mineralized water resources. But we heard testimony last time to our committees that there are folks out irrigating with brackish water with as high as 4,000 TDS. And so I think what we're going to need to do is we're going to have to let the science drive the issue instead of, politics. I mean, that's just my opinion. But now, San Antonio has had a lot of success with going down into the Carrizo and developing some of their brackish, but it's not been without controversy. The other issue that's been a huge success for San Antonio, and I know some others have worked on this, I think El Paso, some others, is their ASR, the Aquifer Storage and Recovery. It works very well in the Carrizo Aquifer, but it may not work so well in our more karst aquifers like the Edwards or the Trinity or places like that. So again, as we navigate, if you will, the concerns, certainly the legislature, I mentioned local control, but protecting private property rights, is a huge issue, at least from my perspective, and I believe from our colleagues' perspective is, so that balance, if you will, of protecting people's private property rights, incentivizing maybe, if you will, property owners with with some programs, with some tools, if you will, to allow water to be pumped to programs. One of the programs, talking on the conservation side, is a program that was implemented by the Edwards, paying farmers, if you will, to not pump during certain critical times when there are low flows and the aquifer begins to drop. There's an opportunity to pay farmers who, instead of farming crops, are actually farming water. And there's been many a person, at least in the Edwards area, who's made a lot of money off of selling or leasing water to San Antonio and other areas. So they actually were farming water. Again, going back to allowing science to be our guide in that regard, and obviously too, and some of you probably read the article in the Texas Tribune. If you haven't, you might want to go look at about brackish water and how it abounds, but the complexities. There's a statement in here, and Carlos and I were talking about it. It says, state law requires that groundwater conservation districts develop goals for aquifers they regulate to make sure they're not depleted by overpumping. And that was a concern of y'all's too when you were on the commission, Kathleen, I know. And absolutely, there's no disagreement with that sentence. The next sentence, though, in that paragraph is, but that rule only exists explicitly, and those two words, only and explicitly are the two options, for freshwater underground. I would disagree with that. I would disagree that the state and that issue, that we do have the opportunity and the responsibility, if you will, to manage and help local communities manage both the brackish and the freshwater. There are some issues, and I will tell you, we went through this with the endangered species lawsuit, of the connectivity, if you will, between brackish water and freshwater, and what happens when there's a depletion of freshwater, and how the invasion of brackish water can somehow pollute the freshwater. I propose to you, again, I'm not the scientist, that the reverse would be true. If you depleted, because of the sensitivity, the brackish water, you might have a problem in reverse. So that, and the last thing I'll touch on is the connectivity or the nexus, if you will, between groundwater and surface water. And I know that I've got some friends out here in the energy business, but as I was talking to the LCRA board the other day, many rivers, if not all the rivers in the state of Texas, a certain amount, sometimes as much as 70% of their flow in critical times in river basins comes from springs. So you cannot disconnect the connection of spring flow and groundwater to surface water. Now, I'm not going to go to the position that the federal government would say, and that is, so we ought to regulate groundwater from a federal perspective. Time's up. Okay, that's it. I mean, that's really, I think that, again, maintaining private property rights, but recognizing this connectivity, I think that as we go down the road, we all need to work together to make sure that we don't get out of balance in trying to address our issues that are facing supply and demand for water for Texas users. So thank you all. Thanks again for inviting me to come.
Thank you all for inviting, so we can talk about this very sensitive issue of water. Chairman White, it's always a pleasure to see you, and I promise you, if I'm fortunate enough to be on the board, it's certainly because, in large part, of the work that we did together a while back, and I very much cherish that. I'd like to take a little bit of time and help us remember and redefine the problem that we're trying to address. I've been talking a lot about throughout the state leading up to to the election on Prop 6, about what House Bill 4 would mean to us, and then certainly afterwards, where is it that we're going with it in developing the rules to implement the program. And in it, we talk about defining the problem. And it isn't just that we all remember how bad 2011 was. It is really about what the future and the water availability for Texas is about. And one of the statistics that I came across this week is what the population in Texas was in 1960, just a little over 9 million folks. And when you get to 2010, 50 years later, we'd grown up to about a little over 25 million people. So we look at the 50-year horizon, and we realize that by 2060, there'll be 82% more Texans living here. We'll be close to 46, 47 million folks. And with that level of growth will come increased demand. Right? And so how is it that we're going to meet that demand going forward in the decades to come? That is exactly the wisdom of Senate Bill 1, being able to prepare decade by decade of when we need to develop these water supply projects and bring them online. We're fortunate to be in a position now to actually fund them and put them in place in a timely manner. But let's keep talking about what the problem is really about. So we get to 2060. We've not addressed it. We have another drought. What's the shortage going to be like? We will be short 8.3 million acre feet of water in 2060 if we do not implement these projects. How much water is that? How does that really compare to the amount of water that we use in Texas? If you go back to 2011, we all remember how bad that was. In 2011, Texas used 18 million acre feet of water. If we are going to be short 8.3 million acre feet, that is a substantial amount of water that we would be short to be able to meet our demand. So that, to me, crystallizes why it's so critical that we address these issues. And we know we can even talk about what would happen if we wouldn't implement these projects. The cost to our economy, $115 billion. Cost to employment, 1.4 million Texans out of jobs. Cost to our population, 1 million Texans would probably have to leave. So that's reason enough to address the concerns that we have. Representative Miller and I were talking about how do we go about fixing the problem, and is there a magic bullet? We both agree there is absolutely no such thing as a magic bullet when it comes to water. How are we going to come up with 8.3 million acre feet of water? About a third of it will come from conservation and reuse, about a third. But we also need to start thinking about the fact that we cannot conserve water simply to continue to use it the exact same way that we're using it today. We need to change our mindset about how it is that we're using it and put it to actually better use as well. A third of the water will come from taking water that we already have today and put it to better use. In some instances, that will mean what Representative Miller was addressing is moving it from where it is to where it isn't. And there are challenges with that, and I promise you, Representative Miller touched on it. Among the many challenges is the federal government's continued attempt to get in the business of water allocations and water movements, in particular interbasin transfers, as of late, that we continue to fight. But the last third will have to come from new sources of water. And there's no such thing as new water. There's just new sources that we'll have to identify and develop. And that's what we're talking about: brackish groundwater, desal as well. And each one of those comes with different costs. And each part of Texas will have a myriad of these projects that will be right for them at different costs. But there is no magic bullet for any one of us. But to add to the problem, we also know one additional thing. Over the next 50 years, the existing supplies of water that we have will be reduced by 10%. Why is that reduction going to occur? Well, every time, and this happens everywhere, if you build a reservoir, you start containing water, it starts silting up. And so you lose that capacity. And if you don't do anything to invest in addressing that loss of capacity, you end up losing that water supply. We continue to exploit groundwater sources. They don't recharge as fast. So that availability also goes down. So we need to plan and address for those contingencies as well. What is it that we're looking forward to at the Water Development Board, and why are we so excited about the opportunities following Prop 6 and the implementation of House Bill 4? We got, because of 73% of Texans voted in favor of Prop 6, $2 billion got transferred from the Rainy Day Fund to the SWIFT, State Water Implementation Fund for Texas. The money has been transferred, is already there. And of course, with that money transfer, I promise you, every single financial institution and banking firm and underwriting firm that exists in the country has been knocking on our door wanting to talk to us. And what we're talking back to them is, tell us the best and brightest ideas of how to invest this money and utilize it so that the multiplier effect going forward, continued with the $6 billion authority that you gave us in 2011, can help us put these projects in place as well. You know, in the passage of House Bill 4, the legislature gives an extremely tight timeline. There is no room for error in this timeline, I promise you. There are many deliverables that have already come and passed, and I'm glad to report that we've met all of them. In fact, we've been early on several of them, but the next few are extremely critical. So obviously the first deliverable is the creation of a full-time board, and I'm very pleased with the board that we have and honored to be one of the ones that were chosen to serve over at the Water Development Board in this critical time. The next major function after that, or the next milestone after that, was the implementation by the regional water planning groups, where the local decisions are made about how we're going to move the projects forward, of the uniform standards by which we will be scoring, not we, how they will be scoring the projects that they've identified to be able to meet the demands going forward. So in this process, I've gotten a lot of questions like, did you know that some regional water planning groups are developing Plan A and Plan B, and so maybe what they're actually planning for is a little bit more water than what they actually need? Well, I think that's a good thing. Because I think as we go forward in trying to test the viability, sustainability, does it make sense to move these projects forward, we may identify for some of them regulatory hurdles that we just cannot overcome. If that project drops out, I promise you the need and the demand for water will not. That will remain, and we better have alternate ways and paths going forward to be able to address that. So the regional water planning groups in the next 6 months, between now and June, will be utilizing uniform standards that they designed for themselves and that the board approved and adopted by December 1st to rank their own projects. They will give us back that list in June. We will give them some feedback. That list will become final in September. That is critical for us, because not only will it instruct the projects that we should consider out of the 2012 plan, but also testing the process for the next iteration of the state water plan as well. And here's an additional wisdom of the implementation of Senate Bill 1. We get to revisit this every 5 years. And we all know the changing dynamics and pressures in Texas for water. So that for the next plan in 2016, I think it'll also be very helpful. Concurrent with that prioritization process that the regional water planning groups are going through, we are charged with developing a rule on how we're going to invest the fund, how we're going to do the process for accepting applications to move projects forward, and how the board will score the projects under different criteria that has been set up by the statute as these projects come to us for funding. Under the statute, that rule has to be approved by March of 2015. I promise you I have no desire to go all the way to March of 2015 to adopt that rule, because there is no room for error. So on January 23rd, the board will consider a timeline that would ideally put us in place to be able to adopt that rule by December of this year. And I think y'all would appreciate that as well. I think it's also critical, as you all know, as we develop these rules, we may identify areas where additional clarification in statute may be warranted, and I think that it's important that we communicate that before the session starts as well. What is it that the public can do to participate in this process? I cannot overemphasize how important and critical it is that people get involved in the regional water planning process. If you are a user group, you have a concern, you want to know about conservation, you want to know about reuse, the things that we need that are important to you when it comes to water, go and participate at the regional water planning groups, particularly in the next 6 months. Get invested in that effort. It will pay off. At the same time, the statute that was passed, House Bill 4, requires very prescriptive oversight on the activities that the board will undertake in the implementation. It is something that I welcome. An advisory group, 3 members of the House, 3 members of the Senate, the comptroller, some staff support from the board will also be applied. That will also help us guide in the development of the rule, the investment of the fund, and how we go about scoring the projects as well. And I think that level of transparency and oversight is warranted. I will close, because I know I only got 2 more minutes, with one last aspect that we've been getting a lot of questions on. Leading up to the election on Prop 6, and then certainly afterwards, the one question that I get asked a lot is, how are you going to deal with conservation? Is it really going to matter? How are you going to deal with rural Texas and things like, and issues like that? The statute is abundantly clear how we have to do it. There is no discretion. The actual wording in the statute is that the Water Development Board will undertake the utilization of not less than 20% of the fund for conservation. I've read statutes long enough to know that's a floor, and that is a hard floor, and we intend to meet that. But the statute also says that the Water Development Board will undertake the utilization of not less than 10% of the fund for rural Texas and agricultural issues. And to that extent, we recognizing the importance of rural Texas as well, we've also created a staff position at the board of Rural Texas Ombudsman, and his responsibility is to go out and assist the smaller communities in rural Texas water concerns and be able to identify and help them through the process as well at the board. I look forward to your questions. Thanks for inviting.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Kathleen, for putting this panel together. We've got a very distinguished panel here, and I feel like I'm a lightweight on this panel. What Kathleen didn't say is that she was a member of our LCRA board just until recently, and unlike me, she was smart enough to get off of it in this trying time that we're in right now. I think Representative Miller had mentioned that, made a little quip about, I guess, the arrogance of the LCRA. And let me tell you, we've been humbled by this drought. That's for sure. That's true. I'll start with telling just a few little tidbits about the LCRA. We were created in 1934 by the Texas legislature. We have no taxing authority, and we generate our own revenues, and we charge for our electricity. We generate electricity, and we serve water. Our electricity business serves over 1 million people, and we have 40 wholesale customers at this point. So we're not only in the water business, we're in the electricity business. As a matter of fact, our water business is probably only about 5% of our business, and our electricity and transmission business is around 95%. But guess where all our headaches are? They're on the water side. We are the second largest transmission provider in the state of Texas, and we've been growing that business significantly over the years also. But our main mission is water. We're big into electricity, we're big into transmission, but I see our main mission as water. We are in control of the Colorado River from San Saba County all the way down to Matagorda. And it's a very significant responsibility, and we take it very, very seriously. And I think we have, there's just no doubt we've been very humbled by this drought. I think in years past, we've always had enough water to go around. For agriculture, for our municipal customers, for industrial customers. We've always had enough to go around, but that doesn't seem to be the case anymore. We are, since 2010, and actually it's kind of started before that, we've been in and out of drought. It's just been a continuous process. Drought has just become a way of life for us. Our inflows from the Colorado River basically feed our two main reservoirs, which is Lake Buchanan and Lake Travis. I don't know if any of you have been around Lake Travis or Lake Buchanan lately, but it's not pretty. It's a very dire situation. They are currently about 38% full. So we've got very low reservoirs at this point. In 2011, our inflows into the system were around 128,000 acre feet. Normally, on a normal year, we will get 1 million acre feet on an average, and just if you average over the last 50 years, 1 million acre feet, and we got 128,000 in 2011. Worst ever that we've ever had in our history at LCRA. We've never had that low of inflows. Even in the drought of 50s, which is the one everyone always looks back to, that is always the one that's measured by. But we were much lower in 2011 than we were in the 1950s. 2012 was better. I think we got around a little less than 400,000 acre feet into the system. And 2013, we had I think around 200,000 acre feet flow into our system. And that was the second lowest in recorded history. So I'm just pointing out that we've got some major issues with our water supply here, and they need some attention, and we are addressing them. Typically, our municipal and industrial users will use around 300,000 acre feet per year. We will also lose about 150,000 acre feet per year just in evaporation on the lakes, surface water. So we need around 450,000 acre feet just to break even. And with 128,000 acre feet in 2011 and 200,000 in 2013, you can see where the problem is. And that is with cutting off agriculture completely, or almost completely. For the last 2 years, and probably in the next year, in 2014, we will also cut off agriculture for another year. Very hard issues, very contentious. I'm sure you've been reading the newspapers. I know our state representatives have been hearing from both sides and senators, and it's very gut-wrenching to go through these meetings and hear all the needs, and there's just not enough water. So how do we address that? Well, at LCRA and when Kathleen was on the board, we had our board got together and we said we're gonna address this problem. Really, actually, we started this in 2010, 2009, and 2010 before we even had the huge drought of 2011, and we decided we're going to add 100,000 acre feet to our water supply, and we're working on that plan. So how are we doing that? We looked at the most cost-effective ways of adding new supply, and the ones we came up with were off-channel reservoirs and groundwater, and we've taken action on both of those. We are adding about 10,000 acre feet of groundwater supply to our system in Bastrop County. We've already drilled 2 wells. We're drilling a total of 5, and we'll use those wells to supplement Lake Bastrop, which is our cooling reservoir for our power plant. So that will further reduce any demands on the Highland Lakes. Well, we should be able to have that whole power plant self-sufficient on groundwater and not have to use our Highland Lakes water for that use. We also have contracted to buy the groundwater rights for the Boy Scout Ranch in Bastrop County, and that could possibly add another 10 to 20,000 acre feet of water over the next few years. Another very significant project we have is the off-channel reservoir that we're working on in the lower basin. It's no surprise to know that there is a whole lot more water on the east side of I-35 than there is on the west. As a matter of fact, it's in some cases double what we get on the west side of 35. So we have no storage or reservoir capacity down in that area. So what we want to do, and we've already purchased property to do this, is to put an off-channel reservoir down in Wharton County. We purchased the land for it. It's going to be, I think it's going to add around 90,000 acre feet to our supply, which will further help out the Highland Lakes and bring additional supplies to the LCRA. I think we've got around 600,000 acre feet total in our firm water supply now, and with these projects, we're looking at another 100 to 110, 120,000 acre feet of additional supply. So we are working very hard and diligently on new supplies. The Proposition 6 passage was a very big help, and we'll be knocking at your door, Chairman, and we'll be looking for some funding for some of these projects. But we are not finished with our quest for new water. I think that we've been. I think we just haven't had a crisis to push us into this, but we are very serious about getting new water supplies, and we'll continue to do so in the future. So anyway, thank you, and I'll be happy to answer any questions a little later.
Thank you, Kathleen, and TPPF for including a private sector fellow in the discussions here. I live in California. We have a business in Texas, and it's interesting for me to see the comparisons to contrast between the water supply issues in California and Texas. They're very similar in many ways, but there are some unique differences. And just one thing that you might notice, California is getting ready to spend $25 billion to fix the Bay Delta. And there's really not going to be any more water generated from that because there's not any more storage. But as a retail water utility guy, one of the things that I get hit with is we're the ones who collect the water from the fees from the customers, the user charges, and we're the first line of sort of criticism, as all of you know. So whether you're public or private, when you're in the retail business, you get the customer feedback immediately. And so while we talk about billions of dollars here and billions of dollars there and all the things we need to do, I think one of the really important considerations is the affordability of water. There's plenty of money out there. People love to invest in water, particularly from the private sector. I think it's a great business and a great resource to invest in. But I wonder sometimes just how we're all going to pay for this. The affordability for the middle income people is being stretched. I mean, they don't have a lot of extra money to go around, rising tuitions and other things, the cost of living and so forth and so on. So one of the things that we're all going to be faced with here, all of the panelists here, is how are we going to pay for all of this? And but I will say that from the private side, water business is one of the most capital intensive utility, if you will, or compared to electricity or anything else. We have to spend more capital per dollar of revenue than almost any utility. And so in that context, it's like, but everybody wants to invest. Everybody understands how important water is in the private sector. There are infrastructure funds, pension funds, Canadian pension funds, international investors that love water. And they have billions and billions of dollars. Some of the global infrastructure partners, Olinda, you can go on and on. These funds have individual funds that total $6-7 billion. And they are all very interested in getting in the private sector water or private investments in water. And they're very willing to accept alternative arrangements, public-private partnerships, unique project management, greenfield projects, lease concessions, and other things to get these projects done. But again, I think where we look at it from our perspective is just how are we going to pay for all of these? And I think that's something that, of course, I don't have the answer, but I know a big part of it is communication, the value of water, and what it really costs to provide the water to your tap. Because for so many years, it's been essentially free. We build our towns and cities on rivers or near the ocean or near a lake or something. That's all over with. It's a quantum leap in the cost of water. And so communication and support from the public officials, the people who really are in charge of our government and a lot of the water infrastructure, is very important. And so I think that, and that education process has to begin right away, in my view. And I think that it's time to consider some other economic or socioeconomic factors. I believe that interest rates will go up quite a bit. And so borrowing cost and the cost of capital is going to go up significantly. And if we wait too long, maybe some of you are sort of, betting the interest rates will go down. I don't think it's a very good idea. I bet they're going to go up. And I do think that that's something, again, that we have to consider because projects will become more expensive as interest rates rise. I think that there's also a great politicization of water, and I think it's probably necessary in a way. It's one of the ways we communicate about water, but also I think it's time to sort of temper some of the criticism, at least in Texas, towards the private sector. Look, give us your poor, your huddled masses, we'll take over those systems, but we're not magicians. And those are the systems, because a lot of Texas is becoming suburban from rural. The water is being, it's higher cost and so forth. And that goes to benchmarking, comparing, cities who have high density and so forth to rural or suburban systems. And I think that it would be a much more constructive approach through really effective regulation to base it on the cost of service. If you decide to live out on the back 40, you might pay a little bit more than if you decide to live in San Antonio or Austin. And, but I think that Texas, on the other side, is doing some very intelligent things. And I think the river authorities are very smart because you're basing your water supply management on an actual geological, hydrogeological boundary, whereas on the groundwater side, it's not. It's a political boundary rather than a geohydro boundary. And I think that's where local control maybe breaks down a little bit. And I know that other panelists here and certainly all of you in the audience know that. But I think I know it's a very important standard in Texas, but I do think it's something that we might have to look at a little bit more carefully. I think agriculture is another important consideration here, at least from my perspective. There's a lot of water that's dedicated to agriculture. And in the Central Valley of California, they're being cut back just like some of the customers of LCI are. And they're responding with innovative techniques, but should we really be raising rice, cotton in arid areas? I think there may be a way to get some water rights from them, and agriculture is a big consumer of water, and I know that's a very tender subject, but I do think there's some additional supplies there. I think there are really some good reasons to be optimistic, but again, I want to focus or try to turn your focus to understanding the true cost of water and to having an effective regulation that supports that if the private sector is involved, because there's so much capital out there. There really is, but for it to be effective, for it to come to Texas, invest, if you want it to invest in water, you're going to have to provide a relatively constant, relatively consistent form of either treatment of the capital or regulation. Because if you don't, it won't come here. It just won't. It's just, but I think there is a great desire to be in Texas. I am very, very appreciative of our opportunity to be here, and I think it's a great state with a great future. So I'll stop there and thank you all for your attention. And Kathleen, thanks again for inviting me.
And so now we will take, how much time do we have left? With the extra time we got because the previous panel was 15? Okay. I'd like to, before we take questions from all of you here, I'd like to allow any of these four panelists to ask another panelist a question. And if you don't have them, we'll move right to the attendees. But sometimes when I've been on panels, it's been very, when I listen to a panelist's remarks, I always want to ask a question.
I don't dare.
Okay.
We're very cautious about that.
Okay, then please, questions, any questions you may have. I'm sure there's some. Please.
Well, if you have this fund, $6 billion, it's going to roll and finance all these projects, you still have to pay the debt service on those projects. There has to be some provision for allocating that cost to the various users. How is that going to happen?
I think this is a question for Chairman Carlos Rubenstein.
Sure. Thank you for the question. That's, I think, part of the beauty of House Bill 4 as well. We got that question a lot leading up to the passage of Prop 6 and then certainly afterwards. People were saying, okay, so we got the $6 billion authority in 2011, and now you're asking for $2 billion more. That's not the way it is. It was not an additive authorization for additional bonding authority. The $6 billion bonding authority is a credit card we haven't used. And so then people ask, why haven't you used it before? Well, that's because we're still exhausting authority that you all gave us in 2001 that we will exhaust in the next 12 to 15 months. The beauty of the $6 billion authority is that it's evergreen. As we lend it out and it gets paid back, we get to lend it out again. But that still doesn't address the question that you asked. The $2 billion that we got from the rainy day fund will be invested. The proceeds from that investment will allow us to do enhanced financing for the public entities that are going to be putting forward these projects. But if you also look at it, the way that it is structured is there also is going to have to be a local component that's going to have to contribute to the project development as well. We will loan money out. It will have an enhanced financing capacity that will incentivize the projects to move forward. How is that enhanced financing going to work? The state is blessed to have a fantastic credit rating, AAA. The country wishes it would have that, right? So we're able to borrow at relatively cheap rates. Because of the investment of the $2 billion and the proceeds that will come from that as well, we'll be able to offer, in some instances, reduced cost to the folks that will be using it, up to 50% of the interest rate as well, because the proceeds that we're getting from the investment of the $2 billion can help offset that. But that's not the only way that we can do enhanced financing. I was city manager in Brownsville, and part of the projects that are going to be developed are going to be from the local side to pay back the loan to the board. It's going to be contingent on their ability to generate the revenues to pay us back, right? But there's a difference when you start a project to when it actually starts generating revenue. Well, House Bill 4 allows us to defer the payments while that project is being developed. We'll put them on the back end, but that again incentivizes the development of the project to put it up online as well. And then the third enhanced financing capacity that the legislature gave us was also to lengthen the term of the loans as well. When you put it all together, it actually mitigates to a degree the rate shock that you're going to get. At the end of the day, people say, well, all of this will translate into higher water rates. The reality is, whatever we do, we're all going to be paying more for water. I hope that addresses your question.
Can I go?
Overlook Lake Travis. We have two big constituencies, the rice farmers and the businesses and people who live there. I'll speak for one person. I'd be happy to pay a special assessment to have more water supply, and form entities to do that. I haven't heard any entity that's been created locally within these water districts or within these areas, like the Highland Lakes, that has a taxing power, an assessing power, other than contracts. And the problem, Australia has existing contracts. How can they add to those to add more capacity? So I'll direct the question to Tim. And Tim, how do you solve the problem?
Well, interestingly enough, that's a good question, and that's come up before, and we've thrown it back, and trying to get you're one of the few that would actually accept an assessment or an additional tax. So I'll get that out there. But this, when the things we're doing by the groundwater that we're developing, the off-channel reservoir, both of those projects will keep and retain more water in Lake Travis. It will happen, and it will. That's what it's designed to do. So and those projects will be paid for by the ratepayers of the city of Austin and all of our customers. So those problems are being addressed, and it will be addressed by what we're working on right now. And there's also, we can do additional reservoirs down in the lower basin. In 2012, 900,000 acre feet went down the Colorado River and into Matagorda Bay, was not captured. That would have more than filled up Lake Travis and almost filled up Lake Buchanan also. We can continue to build additional storage downstream that will also help the issue. But we're starting with this first reservoir. We're starting with groundwater, and those will address the problem.
If I could, Kathleen, just a little bit more on this, and remember, just since you brought it up, I'm sure you understand, but some of the questions we had when we were out working for Prop 6 was, are these grants? Or they're going to be loans. There are loans. They're going to be paid back. They're going to be paid back with interest, and that interest is going to have to come. The return of principal and the interest is going to come from the ratepayers. We have, unfortunately, in Texas, we've gone for a long time with cheap water, and we're starting to recognize some of it. I know that the senator from El Paso was here, and they took on a project a long time ago where they were taking their wastewater and injecting it back into the ground so they could have it later to put it back up. Unfortunately, one of the quotes that was in the San Antonio paper by me when I was much younger and less mature was, at some point in time, we're going to be drinking our wastewater and have to like it. And it's really true. When you think about it, this water is recycled over and over and over again. Carlos said there's not new water. But I know that, for instance, an issue of like with the farmers out in the Medina and Uvalde County area, that when they were moving to more efficient irrigation type devices, LIPA and modified LIPA systems, that there were loans available, not grants, loans available from the Water Development Board, but they were with interest. And when you're talking about 2 and 3% interest, you were talking about it's lower than they could get from a bank or anywhere else. And so it was an incentive because it was less water that the farmer had to use. And every time that farmer pumps a gallon of water, he's paying for the fuel to pump it. So it becomes an economic incentive for them to do it. So there's going to be trade-offs that we're going to have to work through. And again, this is going to what I was saying about striking that balance. One thing that hasn't really been touched on here too much, I mentioned the Sierra Club lawsuit we dealt with back in the 90s, but is the environmental. I also, Speaker Strauss appointed me to the Environmental Flows Committee, which I think, you have a member on or will have a member on. Maybe it's you, Carlos, that's going to serve in that capacity. But the fact is that we sometimes get focused on the water upstream here in the Highland Lakes area in the rice farmers or to the industries. But I got to tell you, those people that are reliant on the bays and estuaries and the fishing industries, both sport and commercial down there, they think it's their water down there, and they would certainly, LBJ could go dry as far as they're concerned. It wouldn't hurt one fish crop, So that's a huge issue that we've got to deal with and think about, if you will, on a global or a statewide perspective as we navigate, if you will, through these. Oh, there's another issue: navigable streams. I didn't even bring that up. So.
More questions? Ben Love, please.
In 2011, the Texas legislature passed, I believe it was House Bill 332, that more clearly delineated the ownership of groundwater. I'd like to hear the panelists' thoughts on ownership of groundwater moving forward in the next few decades.
And could I add to that and to the question? And then a very significant Texas Supreme Court case went either even further clarified the landowners' interest in the groundwater in place, and to those with a lot of Texas history. And the court's ruling said that it was equivalent to the surface landowners' ownership of the minerals in place. But anyway.
Well, I didn't have anything to do with that day case. Yes, I do remember that. You can remind me. I was chairman when the case went to court. And that's exactly right, Mr. Love. We did. I worked with the Wildlife Association, the Farm Bureau, the cattle raisers. All of us worked together and to talk about that. One of the big issues, as you recall, was the issue of vested rights. And one of those things was that we wanted to make sure that I'll tell it by a little story that I remember from the former president of the Texas and Southwest Cattle Raisers Association, a guy by the name of Dolph Briscoe Jr. And when Ed Vaughn, former chairman of the Water Development Board, told his then father-in-law, he said, Governor Briscoe said, well, we got to go up there and make sure that we take care of that right of capture. And he said, well, you got to understand, that 20 or 30 acres out in the middle of the ranch, that guy can suck all the water out from underneath the rest of the ranch, and we can't stop him under the right to capture. And he goes, well, we got to fix that. So I guess it all comes from your perspective. One of the things certainly we did in the Edwards was when we gave those people who had groundwater and could prove up those historic rights the opportunity to sell or lease that water. So there was value, and there was a property value, if you will, for them to do that. So, again, I think we did a good job of maneuvering through that issue and protecting people's private property rights. And the challenge now is, what's the next step, and how do we manage that at the same time take care of the growing need that's happening? And obviously one of the concerns, and I think Carlos is trying to address that through his ombudsman, is how do we take care of rural Texas and the farming and ranching interest especially?
I get that question a lot, and I always try to invoke my best elevator voice in my response, reminding everyone that in Texas, the preferred method of dealing with groundwater is through local control. It is what I have to work with. It is the reality that we live in. And also when we deal with how we manage surface water and all of the things that are also restrictive in the management of surface water, it is what we have to recognize and respect. Will the future change? Only time will tell. But I think, remember the discussion that I had about the 8.3 million acre foot shortage that we're going to have by 2060. And when I hit on that 1/3 that has to come with managing water that we already have in a different way, and part of that may include the decisions that we have to make about moving it with the surface or groundwater from where it is to where it isn't. It's something we have to address.
Any other want to comment on that? We'll take another question, but I hope you and I can talk about the day case, Doug.
Oh, yes,
Because I think it did what, in making the nature of the private property interest in the groundwater in place below the surface, in the way it did legally, it asserted that the system is one of correlative rights and is not, because the rule of capture is just how you exercise the right. Right. And we, through many in early years, a lot of legal conflicts and all that, but the oil and gas interest, we now have a body of law and Railroad Commission rules that apportion that interest. And I think, as a lover of individual rights and property ownership, I think there's actually the new legislation that was mentioned and the Supreme Court really gave, but it will take years to apply it in the courts and to interpret it and all of that. So but I think maybe it has some real sunlight in it. But anyway, next question. Not even one? Yes.
I'm curious to hear from Mr. Roth. He had a comment that, of course, water is one of the most capital intensive.
Can you all hear?
Okay.
I couldn't quite hear you, so you might come to the mic so the whole room can hear you.
I'm curious to hear from Mr. Roth, I guess, just sort of the private sector perspective. Is there a feeling among the private sector that what was done in the House bills in this last session, that it was enough, that it's a workable solution? I know that, for example, with the transportation package, engineers were hesitant to support it or not because they knew that in itself wasn't enough, and so they were concerned that coming back the next session after something had been done, they wouldn't be able to get any support. How does the private sector, in terms of water, feel about the burden that the state is now kind of shifting to them?
Well, I'm not sure I really understand the question. I do
Okay.
know about the shifting of regulation from the TC. Okay. Hello. Okay. If you're talking about the shift of regulation from the TCEQ to the PUC?
I'm more talking about the dollars. Like, is the money that is now available through what's being done with SWIFT and SWIRFT, is that enough for the private sector to now move forward in these extra projects?
Well, we don't. The private sector is not allowed to get funding from the TWDB or SWIFT. It's
okay.
only for the public sector.
Okay. Answers my question.
I think there is, Carlos, correct me, that there is you can create a public-private partnership, but we limit it to either 10 or 20% of the project can be of a private nature. Isn't that right?
We're getting that question a lot, and I think part of the answer also lies in, I agree with what you're stating, but part of the answer lies in the fact that, again, we will be lending money out of SWIFT and SWIRFT to public subdivisions or water supply corporations. But then there's also a local component and local leveraging of dollars that also have to come and be present to move the projects forward. And certainly public-private partnerships will be, I believe, a mix in that aspect as well, in the end, helping the project move.
One of the issues that we had not, I think it was addressed here, or someone asked the question about, why haven't different individuals, different communities moved forward with the 500 and something projects that they've come up, remembering that all of these projects came from local sources. These 16 regions that are across the state that were created back in 1997 when I and a bunch of other folks worked on SB1 with Senator Brown was to have a diverse group. So all of these regional boards are made up. They're county commissioners, city councilmen, private individuals, ranchers, farmers, each one, and in fact, there's a certain criteria that's lined out in SB1 that dictates the minimum diversity that you have. And I know in Region L, we added to that and had some 21 or 22. All the river authorities were not originally included in the appointments. We added the Nueces River Authority and Con Mims, who's now the chairman of it. So, but the reason that some of these projects were not moved forward, what we were hearing was, one, the cost of money, the ease of doing business, the deferral, if you will, that what Carlos said is because when you take off on one of these projects, you don't just go out and start digging dirt, or you don't just start, pouring concrete. So there's a time lag between the time you get the money back from the ratepayer, and that was a prohibiting or I guess a factor that was keeping local entities from moving forward with the project. So what we tried to do in HB4 was address that issue, but it didn't come out of some light in the sky that came down to the legislature. It wasn't a note from heaven. This came from the local communities that this is what they wanted. So that's what Carlos is trying to implement now and develop rules on.
That's correct.
And something which we've not had the time to deal with here, and I know we need to close, is I would submit that at the federal level, certainly, and also at the state level, there remain significant regulatory barriers to these projects, which can add not only great length of time for all the multiple permits, but uncertainty about the final outcome, which is much more difficult for a smaller community, smaller municipality to weather. But
Well, and I agree with you, Chairman. I think we could spend another hour on that topic talking about the aside from the regulatory hurdles that exist that keep some of these projects moving forward, the inappropriate attempts to utilize federal authority in certain aspects of the Clean Water Act to get in the business of what has always been left for the states to do, and that intrusion and how we need to continue to guard against that.
yes, please.
I'd like to ask Mr. Timmerman, with the off-channel reservoir in Wharton County, do you think that'll be completed, and will that be sufficient to supply water to the rice farmers in Matagorda County, Colorado County?
Well, we hope to begin construction on the off-channel reservoir this year in 2014, and we hope to have it complete by 2017. Just like we talked about, there's no magic bullet. It will not take care of, it will not be all things to all people upstream or downstream, but it will help be a part of the system. We have a system, Colorado River system, and it will be another, I think, valuable component, another valuable lever that we can use to supply water to the lower basin, and it also has benefits to the upper basin. Our board took a very difficult vote earlier, I guess late last year, where we were going to cut off environmental flows to the basin estuary, which was brought up earlier. Fortunately, we had rains, and it never came to pass, and we pulled it down, but we had to take that vote. If we had a off-channel reservoir down there with water resources, we could certainly let that water go down to Matagorda Bay as opposed to letting it out of storage in the Highland Lake. So it's I think it's going to be a very valuable tool in our toolbox to address water needs.
Well, Tim, also, and I think to go to your issue is, it is not one silver bullet. There's not one magic thing that if we're going to solve these issues, there's a whole host of different avenues that we're going to have to address. I will tell you this, having 20 plus years experience in the water business, it's kind of like a chess game. I don't know if you know anything about chess, and I know very little. But when you move one piece on the chessboard, it affects all the other pieces. And that's the challenge that LCRA and water development, everybody has, is when you do something, you do a project, it's going to in some way or another affect them. And I will compliment LCRA. They are doing a great job.
Thank you.
They are doing a great job.
I'm the
They've
first
got
one
a
that said
very,
that.
they got a very difficult position that they're in because of the drought.
Thank you.
Would you like to ask?
Yes, I have a question. Obviously, some of the questions here are some of these projects being done. Commissioner, are you aware of what's happening with Colorado River Municipal Water District and the work they've been doing and the work that Midland has been doing and how that relates to conservation?
I'm not only aware of it, I've actually visited the projects that they put in place and extremely impressed with what they've been able to do in responding to, you know, the fact that they, for example, build a $1 million diversion point in one of the reservoirs only to know that they've never been able to turn it on, and how they've been able to have to manage the water from the other 3 reservoirs to bring it back so they can actually meet the demands of the local users, the ability to reuse wastewater and blend it in. Remarkable work that they've done.
Well, I think that's our time, unless there's a burning question. Thank you all very, very much. There's a few handouts, some TPPF publications at the back of the room if you'd liked it, and next year we'll take on another chapter of the water puzzle. Thank you for coming.